Wealth whispers but arrogance screams. When a ruthless billionaire publicly humiliated a struggling waitress over a spilled glass of vintage Bordeaux, he thought he was merely putting a peasant in her place. He had no idea the woman serving his steak was the ghost accountant holding his company's darkest secrets. The air inside Le Pavillon d'Or, Manhattan's most exclusive dining room, always smelled faintly of white truffles and old money. Getting a reservation took 6 months. Keeping a table required a net worth that ended in a B. Elise Bennett adjusted the collar of her stiff, starched white uniform and took a deep, steadying breath. Her feet ached a deep, throbbing pain that radiated up to her calves after 9 hours on the floor. But her face was a masterclass in placid, invisible service. In this room, servers were meant to be ghosts. You poured the water, you cleared the bone china, and you absolutely never spoke unless spoken to. Table 4 was the center of gravity in the room tonight. Seated at the head was Richard Whitmore. Richard was a man who had made his fortune in aggressive corporate acquisitions and brutal real estate development. He was 52, impeccably groomed, with a custom Tom Ford suit that screamed power and a booming voice that demanded an audience. Tonight, he was hosting a victory dinner. Sitting with him were 3 prominent European investors, men Richard was desperately trying to court for a multi-billion-dollar merger involving his flagship enterprise, Whitmore Holdings. "I'm telling you, gentlemen," Richard bellowed, swirling a crystal balloon glass filled with amber liquid, "the American market is entirely composed of sheep. You just need to know how to shear them. It's about leveraging debt. Debt isn't a weakness, it's a weapon." Elise approached the table carrying a silver tray. Resting on the velvet lining was a bottle of 1982 Chateau Margaux, decanted precisely 45 minutes prior, as per the sommelier's strict instructions. The wine cost more than Alice's made in 3 months. "Ah, the wine," Richard said, snapping his fingers at Elise as if she were a disobedient spaniel. "Bring it here, girl. Let's show our friends what real Bordeaux tastes like." Elise stepped forward, her movements practiced and graceful. "Your 1982 Margaux, Mr. Whitmore," she said softly, presenting the label to him before moving to pour the first tasting measure. "Of course it is," Richard sneered, addressing his guests. "You know, the 82 is famous because it was the last year the vineyards in the Rhone Valley avoided the Great Frost. A completely unique terroir." Elise froze. Her hand holding the heavy crystal decanter hesitated for a fraction of a second. The Margaux was from Bordeaux, not the Rhone Valley. It was a completely different region, a different grape, a different climate. It was a massive, embarrassing blunder for someone trying to play the sophisticated wine connoisseur in front of European billionaires. One of the investors, a silver-haired Swiss banker named Henrik, raised an eyebrow. "The Rhone Valley, Richard? Are you quite sure?" Richard's face flushed. He hated being questioned, and he hated looking foolish even more. He looked up at Alice, who was standing perfectly still, her eyes averted, trying desperately to remain invisible. But Richard needed a scapegoat to deflect his geographical ignorance. "Well," Richard barked at her, "you serve the stuff. Tell Henrik here I'm right." Elise swallowed hard. "Sir, I am just here to pour. I didn't ask what you're here to do," Richard hissed, his voice dropping an octave, carrying a venomous edge that silenced the surrounding tables. "I asked you a question. Rhone Valley." "Correct." Elise had a choice. Lie and make the Swiss banker think the restaurant employed morons, or tell the truth and bruise Richard's fragile ego. "Actually, sir," she said, her voice a quiet murmur, "Chateau Margaux is a first growth from the Médoc region in Bordeaux, but it is an exceptional vintage." The silence that followed was deafening. Henrik offered a small, knowing smirk and took a sip of his water. Richard's face turned a mottled, furious red. The veins in his neck bulged against his silk collar. He looked at Elise not as a human being, but as a piece of garbage that had suddenly started speaking. "Bordeaux," Richard muttered, the word tasting like acid in his mouth. He suddenly pushed his chair back violently. As he did, his elbow swung out, intentionally and brutally striking the silver tray Elise was holding. The heavy crystal decanter tipped. Time seemed to slow down as the deep red liquid surged over the glass lid. Elise scrambled to catch it, but the weight was too much. The wine cascaded over the edge of the tray, splashing violently across the pristine white linen tablecloth and directly down the front of Alice's uniform. A collective gasp echoed through the dining room. "Look what you've done." Richard roared, jumping to his feet. He pointed a thick finger directly at Alice's face. "Are you blind, you stupid girl? You just ruined a $5,000 bottle of wine." "Mr. Whitmore, I am so sorry you bumped my arm." "I bumped your arm?" Richard laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "I bumped your arm? You clumsy, uneducated little dropout. You probably couldn't even point to France on a map. And you have the audacity to lecture me about wine, and then you pour it all over my table." Simon, the restaurant manager, came sprinting across the dining room, his face pale with panic. "Mr. Whitmore. Mr. Whitmore, I am so incredibly sorry. We will replace the bottle immediately, on the house." "You damn well better," Richard shouted, spit flying from his lips. He turned his attention back to Elise, who was standing there, shivering slightly, the cold, expensive wine soaking through her blouse. "Look at her. This is what's wrong with this city. You hire the absolute bottom of the barrel, uneducated, lazy, incompetent trash who can't even hold a tray steady. What is your name, sweetheart?" "Elise," she whispered, her eyes burning with unshed tears of humiliation. "Well, Elise," Richard said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a crumpled $100 bill and threw it onto the floor at her wine-soaked shoes. "There, go buy yourself a mop, and maybe a GED textbook while you're at it, because serving food is the absolute ceiling of your pathetic life." Simon grabbed Elise's arm, his grip painful. "Get out of sight," he hissed in her ear. "Go to the back, now." Elise didn't look at the money on the floor. She didn't look at the pitying stares of the other wealthy patrons. She kept her chin up, turned on her heel, and walked toward the kitchen, the wet fabric of her uniform clinging to her skin like a badge of shame. Behind her, she could hear Richard's booming laugh as he sat back down. "Apologies, gentlemen. Good help is impossible to find these days. Now, where were we on the acquisition terms?" In the employee locker room, the sounds of the restaurant faded into a dull hum. Elise stood in front of the scratched mirror. The red wine looked like a massive, gaping wound across her chest. She turned on the faucet and let the cold water run over her trembling hands. She wasn't crying. The tears that had threatened to fall in the dining room had evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. Richard Whitmore thought she was an uneducated waitress. He thought she was a dropout. He thought she was a nobody. Elise reached into her locker and pulled out her burner phone. She opened a secure encrypted messaging app. "He's here," she typed. "Table 4. And he just made the biggest mistake of his life." To understand the sheer magnitude of Richard Whitmore's miscalculation, one had to know who Elise Bennett actually was. Or rather, who she used to be. 3 years ago, she wasn't Elise Bennett, the invisible waitress. She was Elise Harper, a senior forensic auditor at Kensington & Associates, one of the most ruthless and elite accounting firms on Wall Street. She held master's degrees from Wharton and MIT. Her specialty was unraveling highly complex, intentionally obscured corporate financial webs. She found the money that powerful men desperately wanted to hide. And 3 years ago, she had found Richard Whitmore's money. During a routine audit of a shell company looking to merge with a Kensington client, Elise had noticed a series of bizarre fractional discrepancies. They were microscopic fractions of pennies siphoned off thousands of transactions, buried beneath layers of offshore LLCs registered in the Cayman Islands and Cyprus. It was a classic salami-slicing embezzlement scheme, but executed on a scale Elise had never seen before. Over $1 billion of phantom debt had been created to inflate the stock price of Whitmore Holdings. She had compiled the evidence. She had taken it to her senior partner. 2 days later, Elise's world exploded. Her secure terminal was wiped. Her apartment was raided by federal agents based on an anonymous tip. Manufactured evidence was found planted on her personal hard drives, making it look like she was the one attempting to extort Whitmore Holdings. The firm fired her instantly. The threat of federal prosecution hung over her head like a guillotine. She was blacklisted from the financial sector worldwide. She lost her career, her reputation, and her savings defending herself against the fabricated charges. She was completely broken, but Richard Whitmore hadn't killed her. And that was his fatal error. For 3 years, Elise had lived in the shadows. She changed her last name. She took menial jobs, paying strictly in cash. She lived in a cramped, drafty apartment in Astoria, Queens. But every night, when the rest of the city slept, Elise hunted. She rebuilt her digital footprint using ghost servers. She tracked Whitmore's shell companies. She mapped out his entire fraudulent empire piece by piece, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Tonight, the universe had delivered Richard Whitmore to her tableside. After her shift ended, Simon had suspended her for a week without pay as punishment for upsetting a VIP. Elise took the subway back to Queens. The midnight train was empty, rattling through the dark tunnels. Elise sat perfectly still, the smell of sour wine still lingering in her hair. She walked up the 4 flights of stairs to her apartment, locked the deadbolt, and immediately went to her desk. The desk was out of place in the shabby apartment. It held 3 high-resolution monitors, a custom-built processing tower, and a heavily modified router running through a constantly shifting VPN. Elise sat down, her fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard. The screens flickered to life, illuminating her face in a pale blue glow. While Richard had been busy berating her, Elise had been working. When she was leaning in to pour the wine, she wasn't just smelling the Margot. She was reading the document sitting casually on the table next to Henrik's plate. Richard was so arrogant, so confident in his superiority, that he left confidential term sheets exposed in a public restaurant. She had memorized an alphanumeric code printed on the top right corner of the document. Project Icarus, account routing. CY8839, Whitmore Lux. Project Icarus, Elise murmured to herself in the quiet of her apartment. Flying a little too close to the sun, aren't we, Richard? She brought up her terminal interface and initiated a secure handshake protocol with a backdoor she had planted in the Luxembourg banking registry 2 years ago. It took 20 minutes of tense, silent waiting as her brute force algorithm chewed through the encryption layers. Suddenly the screen blinked green. Access granted. Elise pulled the ledger for the CY8839 account. Her eyes scanned the scrolling columns of numbers. What she saw made her heart pound against her ribs. Richard wasn't just faking his company's value. He was on the verge of total collapse. The entire multi-billion-dollar merger he was pitching to the European investors was a desperate, illegal Ponzi maneuver. He was using the European capital to silently pay off massive hidden margin calls he owed to Russian creditors. If the European merger didn't go through by the end of the month, Whitmore Holdings would default, and Richard would be exposed to both the SEC and the Bratva. He was hanging by a single fraying financial thread. "You called me uneducated," Elise whispered to the empty room, a cold, dangerous smile spreading across her lips. "Let's see how smart you really are." She opened a secure code editor and began to write a script. It wasn't a virus, it was a beacon. She programmed the script to attach itself to the Luxembourg ledger. The moment Richard or his CFO attempted to authorize the transfer of the European investors' funds into the Russian accounts, the script would trigger. But Elise didn't want to just stop the transaction. Stopping it would only freeze the assets. She wanted to destroy the man who had ruined her life and humiliated her in front of a room full of people. She configured the script to execute a series of automated wire transfers. Instead of routing the funds to Richard's hidden debt accounts, the script would divert the capital into an irrevocable charitable trust dedicated to funding adult education and GED programs for underprivileged workers, a trust heavily monitored by the IRS, making the money untouchable. Simultaneously, the beacon would automatically blind copy the actual, undoctored financial ledgers of Whitmore Holdings directly to the inbox of the lead investigator at the Securities and Exchange Commission, the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal, and most importantly, Henrik, the Swiss investor. Elise hit enter. The script compiled, vanished into the dark web, and settled silently into the architecture of the Luxembourg Bank, like a landmine waiting for a footstep. She leaned back in her chair, rubbing her tired eyes. The physical exhaustion of the restaurant shift was gone, replaced by the electric hum of adrenaline. Richard Whitmore had thrown a $100 bill at her feet and told her she was worthless. In exactly 48 hours, when he tried to close the Icarus deal, he was going to find out exactly how much a ruined, uneducated waitress could cost him. Elise stood up, finally unbuttoning her wine-stained uniform. The game was no longer a matter of waiting. The final move had been played. Now all she had to do was watch his empire burn. 48 hours later, the atmosphere inside the executive boardroom of Whitmore Holdings was electric. Situated on the 60th floor of a towering glass monolith in Lower Manhattan, the room offered a panoramic, God's-eye view of the city. To Richard Whitmore, it was the only view that mattered. Down there were the ants. Up here were the titans. Richard stood at the head of a massive mahogany table, projecting an aura of absolute, unshakable confidence. He wore a navy bespoke suit that draped perfectly over his shoulders, his silver hair immaculately styled. But beneath the expensive Italian wool, a cold sweat pricked his skin. Today was the deadline. If the European capital didn't hit his shadow accounts by noon, the Russian creditors would initiate asset seizures by 1,000. The resulting panic would tank Whitmore Holdings stock, triggering the SEC audits he had spent 3 years desperately dodging. His entire life's work was balancing on the edge of a razor. Seated around the table were his CFO, David Aris, a nervous man who currently looked like he was about to vomit, and the European delegation, led by Henrik, the Swiss banker from Le Pavillon d'Or. "Gentlemen," Richard began, his booming voice echoing off the floor-to-ceiling windows, "I want to personally thank you for your vision. The Icarus merger isn't just a transaction, it's a paradigm shift. We're about to corner the commercial real estate market on 2 continents." Henrik offered a tight, polite smile. He adjusted his platinum rimless glasses and looked down at the final contract. "The terms are aggressive, Richard, but your balance sheets over the last quarter show remarkable liquidity. We are prepared to proceed." Richard's heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, but his smile never wavered. "Excellent. David, if you would do the honors." David nodded, his fingers trembling slightly as he opened his secure platinum laptop. The protocol was simple. Henrik's consortium would wire the first tranche $600 million into the Whitmore Lux escrow account. From there, David would instantly route the funds through the Cyprus shell companies to pay off the Russian margin calls, effectively making the debt disappear before the European investors even knew they owned a heavily leveraged company. Initiating the escrow transfer now, Henrik stated, tapping his tablet. Funds released. Received, David said, exhaling a shaky breath. 600 million confirmed in the Luxembourg account. I am now executing the internal asset allocation protocol. David typed his administrative password and hit enter. For exactly 3 seconds, the boardroom was completely silent, save for the low hum of the air conditioning. Richard mentally calculated the time it would take to order a celebratory bottle of champagne, perhaps a vintage far superior to the one the clumsy waitress had ruined. Then David's screen flashed red. It wasn't a standard error message. It was a massive screen-filling block of crimson digital text that read, "Routing overrid initiated." "David," Richard asked, his voice suddenly sharp. "What's the delay?" I don't know," David stammered, his fingers flying frantically across the keyboard. "The system locked me out. The funds. The funds aren't going to Cyprus." "What do you mean they aren't going to Cyprus?" Richard snapped, abandoning his composed facade and marching over to David's side. "Stop the transfer. Cancel it." "I can't." David's voice pitched upward in panic. "The master override is rejecting my credentials. The money is moving, Richard. All of it, but not to our accounts." Henrik stood up, his face hardening. "Richard, what exactly is happening here? Where is our capital going? A minor technical glitch." Richard lied smoothly, though his stomach was in freefall. "David, pull the server plug if you have to. Do it now." "It's not on our servers," David shouted, ripping his tie loose. "The reroute is happening inside the Luxembourg banking architecture." Someone planted a script in the ledger. Suddenly, the massive 80-inch smart screen at the end of the boardroom, usually reserved for PowerPoint presentations, snapped on. The Whitmore Holdings logo vanished, replaced by a simple, stark white background. Black text began to type out across the screen in real time, accompanied by the mechanical clack of a vintage typewriter. "Transaction complete. $600,000 successfully routed to the Second Chance Foundation for Adult Education." Richard stared at the screen, the blood draining from his face. "Adult education?" he whispered, the memory of his cruel taunts at the restaurant suddenly echoing in his ears. "Go buy yourself a GED textbook. There's more," David choked out, staring at his laptop in absolute horror. The script. It didn't just move the money. It triggered an automated data dump. It copied the actual undoctored ledgers, the Cyprus accounts, the Russian debt, the phantom equity. Copied them to where? Richard roared, grabbing David by the lapels of his suit. Before David could answer, a synchronized chorus of chimes filled the boardroom. Every cell phone, tablet, and smartwatch belonging to the European investors pinged simultaneously. Henrik slowly picked up his phone. He opened an encrypted email that had just bypassed all of his corporate spam filters. As his eyes scanned the attached documents, his expression shifted from confusion to a cold, terrifying fury. "Cyprus shell accounts," Henrik read aloud, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Hundreds of millions in hidden margin calls to the Russian bratva. Phantom assets used to inflate stock prices." He looked up, his eyes locking onto Richard like a sniper's crosshairs. "You weren't merging with us, Richard. You were robbing us to pay off the mob." "Henrik, listen to me," Richard pleaded, raising his hands, the veneer of the billionaire titan shattering completely. "Those documents are forged. It's corporate espionage. A targeted attack." "The SEC doesn't seem to think so," Henrik replied, turning his phone screen to face Richard, "because this email was CC'd to the Director of Enforcement at the Securities and Exchange Commission. the Financial Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Richard staggered backward, his legs giving way until he collapsed into his leather chair. The walls of his glass empire were instantly, violently caving in. Chaos consumed the boardroom. The European investors were shouting into their phones, commanding their legal teams to freeze every asset connected to Whitmore. David was sitting on the floor holding a trash can, violently dry-heaving as he realized he was going to federal prison for corporate fraud. Through it all, Richard sat paralyzed. His brain couldn't process the velocity of his destruction. Who could have done this? Who had access to the Luxembourg backdoor? Suddenly, Richard's private cell phone buzzed in his breast pocket. It was a secure line, known only to his family and his highest-level fixers. He pulled it out with trembling hands. The caller ID simply read, "Unknown number." He answered it, pressing the phone to his ear. "Who is this?" He rasped, his voice sounding hollow and small. "You know, Richard," a calm, feminine voice echoed through the speaker. "I actually do know where the Rhone Valley is. It's in the south of France, famous for Syrah and Grenache. Not exactly the terroir for a Bordeaux." Richard's breath hitched. The voice was familiar, quiet, steady, the voice of a ghost from 2 nights ago. "The Waitress," he breathed, his eyes widening in a mixture of disbelief and sheer terror. "You." "My name is Elise Harper," she said, her tone devoid of malice, carrying only the absolute weight of justice. 3 years ago, you framed a Kensington forensic auditor to cover up your embezzlement. You took my career. You took my reputation. You threw $100 at my feet and told me I was uneducated trash. "Elise," Richard begged, sweat pouring down his face. "Please, I can fix this. I can give you whatever you want, money. A firm. Name your price." "You don't have any money left, Richard," Elise replied softly. "Your Russian creditors have already been notified that you lost their capital. The FBI is currently in the lobby of your building. And that $600 million, it's locked in an irrevocable, federally protected trust. You just became the greatest philanthropist for adult education in New York history. You ruined me." Richard screamed into the phone, slamming his fist onto the mahogany table, drawing the disgusted stares of the European delegates. "You ruined my life over a spilled glass of wine." "No," Elise corrected him. "The wine was just the appetizer. Your hubris ruined your life. I just handed you the bill." The line went dead. Down in the lobby of the Whitmore building, the scene was playing out exactly as Elise had promised. A dozen black SUVs had jumped the curb. Federal agents wearing navy blue windbreakers with FBI and SEC emblazoned in yellow letters poured through the revolving glass doors, bypassing the stunned security guards. Up in the boardroom, the doors violently swung open. 2 federal agents stepped inside, their badges raised. "Richard Whitmore," the lead agent announced, his voice cutting through the panic. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, securities fraud, and racketeering. Please step away from the table and keep your hands where I can see them." Henrik adjusted his jacket, shooting Richard a look of profound disgust. "You were right about one thing, Richard," the Swiss banker said coldly as he walked toward the exit. "The American market isn't for sheep. It's full of wolves. And you just got eaten." Richard didn't fight as the cold steel handcuffs clicked around his wrists. He was paraded out of his own boardroom, marched past his terrified employees, and shoved into the elevator. As the doors closed, sealing his fate, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the polished brass panels. He didn't look like a titan anymore. He just looked like an old, broken man. Miles away, in a tiny apartment in Queens, Elise Harper closed her laptop. The roar of her computer's cooling fans spun down into silence. She walked over to her small kitchenette and opened the cupboard. She didn't have any 1982 Chateau Margaux. In fact, All she had was a $10 bottle of cheap red blend she had bought at the corner bodega. She poured herself a glass, the liquid splashing into the cheap glass without fanfare. She walked over to her narrow window, looking out over the sprawling, messy, beautiful skyline of New York City. The morning sun was just beginning to break over the buildings, casting a warm, golden glow across the brick facades. Her burner phone buzzed on the counter. It was an email from Kensington and Associates. The subject line read, "Urgent inquiry, reinstatement and apology." Elise took a slow, deliberate sip of her cheap wine. It tasted better than any vintage in the world. It tasted like freedom. She smiled, picked up her phone and tossed it straight into the trash can. She didn't need them anymore. She didn't need to hide in the shadows, and she certainly didn't need to pour water for arrogant men who thought they owned the world. The waitress was gone, the auditor had returned, and her books were finally balanced. If you loved this story of ultimate revenge, don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who appreciates a brilliant plot twist, and hit that subscribe button. We bring you thrilling, real-life drama stories every single week. What would you have done in Alice's shoes? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and ring the notification bell so you never miss an update.